Cool to see everybody here. We've emphasized throughout this club the importance of having an honest framing of American culture, representing it authentically and not falling into pseudo-identities or distractions, especially if they seem to be sold to young people, especially. These things often replace original identity with synthetic ones. What is that artificial identity? It can be described a few ways. Politically, some of the labels that may be accurate are neoconservative, Straussian, maybe among others. Remnants from the 2000s still try to wield power in political spaces, wage a culture war across the generations, including Generation Z. In the next slide, I'd like to pay respect to one of them, Sam Francis, a writer, columnist who represents a pre-modern personality. Now, that doesn't hold a lot of water in DC, in journalism, and some would argue not in mainstream discourse. At least some would argue that, maybe not yet fully. We can see the by pundits, people like Blake Masters, members of the Teal Network. It appears he has been vindicated as time goes on. However, he wasn't rewarded for being ahead of the curve, quite the opposite. What happened to Francis is something that happens to a lot of people. Things out. This is a pattern that young people cannot afford to eat the cost of. However, with patience, as many fans of Francis seem to have, the Overton window will shift in our direction in due time. As a close friend of mine and ours, metaphorically, Mr. Thomas 777 reminds us that 20 years ago, it was about 10 or so people ranting to themselves about future prospects on the right in forums. Today, there is, dare I say, a scene coinciding with the legacy of Francis and his dissident right perspective that is more in tune with the American majority than we might otherwise assume, people on the left and the right. So again, he is a columnist, a writer, and often summarized by his critics. One of the things that prompted this speech was an article describing his quote-unquote story, his arc. One thing that stood out, Dinesh D'Souza is a commentator who publicized his quotes. Some thought they were too far to the right. In the article, some of the quotes D'Souza captured were featured in the Washington Post. What Francis had said, and then later on, were incompatible with conservatism. Now, that can cause someone to wonder a few things. What is conservatism? Where are Francis and D'Souza in relation to conservatism? And what are the do's and don'ts of conservatism? Well, in the next slide, this might help us put everything into perspective, or at least most things. The people behind me, we seem to be familiar with, they had supporters and they had critics that put them somewhat outside, or at least in limbo, with the mainstream conservative right in America. So we'll try to properly frame that honestly. To give proper credit to Francis, I'd like to emphasize his legacy by going through some of his material. In the next slide, one of the concepts he often gets credited for, a term some of us may be familiar with, anarcho-tyranny. One of the shortcomings of American discourse is the perversion of language, among other things. The categorization of identities is all over the place, especially now. We should try to reclaim the proper framing of political terms. Anarchy and tyranny are opposite terms, yet the government has found a way to take aspects from both and wield them against certain people and not others, at least in the United States. That's why, if you can imagine, when you see riots are allowed to happen, and yet people are detained for not wearing a mask, for instance, it's not due to a lack of resources from the government. Francis argues this is deliberate. It's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. Francis claims that the people who are prosecuted are not arbitrary. The people who are allowed to disrupt are part of a protected class. So that should make more sense next time you see similar things on social media or on TV. In the next slide, one person Francis talks about is James Burnham and his analysis. If you are familiar with people like Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, he seems to introduce people to another way of looking at politics, making sense of things in the digital age. Things like the Italian elite theory, which are often obscure to some people. I think it may be more appropriate to promote Sam Francis instead as a substitute, because I think it's more in tune with the historic American identity that we are often trying to understand. Where did it get subverted? The story of James Burnham often rhymes with Francis. Burnham was a political theorist who showed American conservatives what the obstacles were concerning cultural shifts, trends, movements that were mobilizing against the interests of the people. Burnham was not a household name, maybe not conventionally speaking, in mainstream circles, and neither was Francis, according to some. However, both have been vindicated as figures who did not talk about politics in the ordinary fashion, talking about how both of them, social revolutions, or in Burnham's term, managerial revolution, brought another class of people into the government. One of the best examples is the New Deal. Once the New Deal happened, both people on the left and the right seemed to surrender to it as if the debate had already been settled, and they conceded that it was a legitimate policy moving forward. Burnham and Francis also had interesting careers. Rather than assimilating into the magazine class, you could say, the pundit class, think tank stooges, they described a pre-modern worldview to make sense of modernity. Burnham described an alternative take on the 20th century, a century not exclusively made up of bad things, of course, but a historical change to a different phase. He argues managers and bureaucrats tried to compete against the preceding elites. That is the managerial state or regime, you could classify it as. Many are familiar with communism and fascism as occupied governments within their nations. Those two examples seem to be the extent of it as far as the Howard Zinn framing is concerned. How about FDR in the United States? Also part of the managerial revolution. Many people seem to miss that. In the next slide, the next concept was personally probably the most interesting one when I was first getting familiar with Francis and his material. He described his opposition in a unique way. He called them beautiful losers. People on the right having a certain agenda, rhinos, neocons, you could describe them, and people on the right allowing it to happen. People who don't support populist figures like Trump, people that toe a party line. Neoconservatism, as he defines it, is less of a political thought and more of a policy movement. This categorization puts things into perspective. If we look at the next slide, we can see a recent event that may concern some people our age. We can find Dan Crenshaw on a stage at a youth summit in Houston, as if this is the best American conservatism has to offer to young people. Basically, George Bush for Zoomers. Think of the implication. The neoconservative movement and the managerial regime are often the same thing. According to them, the youth are supposed to rally behind a movement that Francis described as, quote, permanent intervention in world affairs, expensive foreign aid programs, the prospect of global war, and the renunciation of national interests in return for a cosmopolitan one world. That's the neocons. That is often sold as the only right-leaning group that exists for young people, rather than this next slide. It seems like people our age are often told, or rather not told, about the old right, most figures before the 1960s. Since people aren't aware of it, it often gets memory hold. However, thanks to people like Paul Gottfried, a writer at Chronicles Magazine, among others, an author talking about the American conservatism and the movements that go along with it, we can start to make sense of what happened to the American right. If we go to our next slide, this might be the proper context for everything said before and will be said right now. William F. Buckley is a figure that explains the gatekeeping that happened and continues to happen in American politics. He helped with National Review, a right-leaning magazine, for those that don't know, and then people started disappearing from the conservative movement. The John Birch Society, people who criticized the Vietnam War. Why is that? Is it like that article we mentioned earlier? Did they violate one of the don'ts in conservatism? It's because there's a problem with gatekeeping in politics. That's what D'Souza did to Francis. That's what happened to McCarthy, George Wallace, Richard Nixon, Enoch Powell. They were scrutinized because of that. They were not allowed in the gate. Meanwhile, Buckley can say controversial things about the civil rights era during the civil rights era, but no one else seems to be allowed to. That double standard seems to continue to be applied because he is the gatekeeper. And most right-leaning people, even if they don't know it, are often influenced by a Buckley-esque worldview. This was in the 1960s alone. The book right there, that is a book called In Search of Anti-Semitism. Buckley was still around when he wrote that book, addressing the controversial people of the 90s. That included people we're familiar with, Pat Buchanan, and one person on the next slide. Joe Sobran was at National Review with Buckley, same time throughout the 80s, and was removed for having controversial views and some of the stuff that he had written. The person on the right is Mel Bradford, who was going to be in the Reagan administration in the early 80s. He was ousted for criticizing Lincoln and possibly for supporting Governor Wallace in his past. Again, ignoring the academic work that he and Sobran shared outside of these controversies. This part here is from Wikipedia, although I think it's insightful. Author Keith Preston later described the successful effort to cancel, keyword, Bradford's nomination as symbolic of the cosmopolitan neoconservatives descended from liberalism, establishing hegemony over the Republican Party and American conservatism as a movement, displacing more traditionalist and regionalist thinkers. That's usually in reference to Southern conservatives, people who are unapologetic about the South and that identity, with ideological roots in the old right, as mentioned earlier. A letter supporting Bradford's nomination sent to President Reagan during the controversy was more aligned with the old right, was more aligned with the old right, pre-60s right, for reference there. And people like, or it was signed rather by a number of people, including Buckley, by the way. So credit where credit is due, and somebody who we may be familiar with, Russell Kirk. That is who is more in sync with the old right, pre-60s identity. And who supported the replacement of Bradford during this ordeal? It was, to no one's surprise, the neoconservatives. Norman Podhoretz from Commentary Magazine, and of course, Irving and Bill Kristol, prominent figures in the neoconservative representation on the right. And so you can see the dynamic that Francis emphasizes in his writing. The infighting, allegedly, factions within parties. That doesn't make sense in a conventional left versus right dichotomy, red team versus blue team. Politics makes more sense when we address all personnel involved. So who else is part of the social and political resistance? People defended in this club, Pat Buchanan, Phyllis Schlafly, among others, who were also too right too soon and paid a price for it. Now, in the next slide, one of the final attributes of Sam Francis, arguably one of the most controversial ones, Francis's stance on the modern interpretation of equality. Now, I want to preface, very important, I think when people usually think about the word equality in the Christian context, I want to emphasize, I am not rebelling against Christianity. I speculate that in heaven, equality in some form exists. In the material, temporal world, inequality does happen to exist, and it's about how to manage that appropriately. And Francis addressed that in some of his writings, just to be clear. Francis is describing the modern equality that is often wielded as a political weapon. Just like the New Deal, the Civil Rights era and the legislation that went along with it could be described as a social revolution if we use Burnham's logic. Both are used as political tools to save the people that purport to defend, or rather use, equality as something to galvanize a movement, to keep those modern activists who use that modern interpretation, saving those people, often people from the 1960s, from criticism. Christopher Caldwell, who was shown earlier, he talks about the weaponization of the civil rights legislation and in his book, Age of Entitlement. But why do people bother defending that? Because there is an assumption that people need that legislation in order to live in a safe country. I'll end this section with a quote from Bradford: "Trying to preserve property, secure tranquility, and promote equal rights all at the same time ensures that none of these purposes will be accomplished, and ensures also a terrible, unremitting tension both among those in power and among those whose hopes are falsely raised." The next slide, the reason some of this sounds like a different right-wing platform, probably especially to some of us our age, it's because this was the worldview that people had for centuries ago and often took it for granted. People learn about the Enlightenment without seeing its critics, people like Joseph de Maistre, among others. They need to see the alternative and that there is a canon that supports their concerns and that do not conflict with Christian ethics, morality. So to mention Buckley again, these characters and their modern versions too, Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, Breitbart, among others, these characters have wedges for the sake of damage control. There's probably some hesitation mentioning Sam Francis's name. Meanwhile, Pat Buchanan is someone who is probably more likely to be welcomed into the mainstream fold. Maybe that's a matter of credentials, running for president twice, being a political commentator. Yet what is the distinction, identity-wise, between Buchanan and Francis? This dissident right personality exists. It's one of the people at the metaphorical table. Some behave like the pundit class are the only game in town because set standards can stay within those margins that out exclusively for people that they approve of. However, this is not sustainable because lots and lots of people, the people that Francis described as middle American radicals, people that were voters of Wallace, Nixon, Trump, etc., these people often do not fit that gatekeeping profile. And in the next slide, to bring it back to Burnham once again, someone like Francis and his views can survive if people keep his legacy going. Not unlike Murray Rothbard, who explains how if the right understands what they're up against, they can outmaneuver opposition in the way that even the Daughters of Confederacy, basically, we can see them as a movement that continued a 19th century cause into the 20th, seeing it as an intergenerational struggle, a job that has to be passed down to the youth. Might be a better way of framing this. And now, how about a more optimistic guess at the future? As Francis said in a speech in 1996, which people should probably check out, quote, "The internet is a hopeful instrument," unquote, thanks to alternative media. And then because, quote, "media conglomerates are not going to be able to preserve their monopoly of ideas," unquote. Some more words from that same speech. He mentioned a right-wing ACLU, something you rarely hear pitched. That's something that's interesting along with the other things listed. Now, why would that be necessary? Something like a right-wing ACLU? Because people allow themselves to toe another line, a line that's set by similar gatekeepers, the line of the SPLC and its critics, people who are canceling commentators, articles that are used to change people's legitimacy within mainstream discourse, people that can get TV gigs. Outlets like I Am 1776, a Teal project, should not be the only places to find commentary like that. People like Blake Masters should not be the exception in all of the pool of candidates that talk about dissident right-leaning politics. There should be more people given the benefit of the doubt, people like Francis, Sobran, Bradford. Solidarity on the right that doesn't compromise with fusionism, ostracizing, not to be beholden to gatekeepers in politics as they often have. And in conclusion, in the final slide, just pay respects. Sam Francis has been through a lot before and after his death, and this presentation is a tribute, paying respect to a pre-modern man in modern times, since his legacy is going to be relevant for politics in the foreseeable future, not just for people, but young people too, should get familiar with his writings. A man who understood the world as it was changing around him and tried to defend the people trying to preserve it. So, thank you. Do we have any questions? This is an audience, by the way, of Zoomers. So a lot of the Sam Francis lore is often memory hold. Yes, Zoomer, please speak.
Okay, what is the, you said that Dinesh D'Souza like cancels him. What were these quotes that he used to like against him?
Sure, it was an event that D'Souza attended, and Sam Francis was there giving a speech. He was talking about Southern identity, because Sam Francis is from Tennessee. And so he was talking about the way that white people can see themselves as a voting bloc like other groups. And Murray Rothbard talks about this having a coalition. He calls them Middle American radicals. That's Francis's term. Murray Rothbard talks about how you can use a lot of the disaffected people in the flyover states to kind of have a similar coalition that Nixon had, how he kind of united Protestants and Catholics. And that was a giant voting bloc that is often not really used on the right, and even to this day. So D'Souza aired out that some of those quotes saying that white people need to see themselves as a voting bloc, paraphrasing. And then that was published in the Washington Post. And then I believe Francis was working at the Washington Times at that moment, and he was let go. And ever since then, it seems like he hasn't been welcomed in mainstream American conservative discourse. And so that's just a pattern that seems to repeat itself. And Sobran, similar thing. He was writing, just like people like Peter Brimelow too. Those two examples, people that worked in National Review, they had the credentials to work in respectable politics, quote unquote respectable. And a lot of their quotes are used against them. But meanwhile, people like William F. Buckley were talking about how, they were saying the same things that Francis was saying in the 90s during the 60s, but because after Wallace lost the election, he changed his tune and kind of towed a party line, Buckley did, and stopped talking about identity, kind of started to have the more cosmopolitan personality. So a lot of the critics that we go after, the pundit class, they seem to have this blueprint of you defame people that are to your rights, you defame people that compete against the journalist class, the bio-Leninist class. And so that is what D'Souza did. He was that generation of doing that. But this had been happening for years. This stuff goes back, and people probably don't even realize that. The Daily Wire is not an arbitrary outlet. That they have gatekeepers just as much as, Buckley criticizing Buchanan in the 90s and people in the 60s. So it's part of this intergenerational story that I don't think a lot of people realize. People think on their timelines that these are just random pundits that are on their side, but it's because it's curated selectively. So that's what happened with Francis. He kind of fell victim to that trap, so to speak. Yes.
Didn't Burnham co-found National Review? When do you think he started to lose influence then?
Well, Burnham's an interesting character because he used to be a Trotskyite, and so he had communist sympathies. But I think after, I don't know exactly the timeline, but once him and Buckley were in National Review, it might be relevant to mention that Buckley and Burnham have ties to the CIA. Maybe that's just a coincidence. But they created this outlet that basically became the gatekeeper for conservatism. People like Wallace and the John Birch Society were ousted. And so they defined allegedly respectable politics. And I don't know at what point Burnham became conservative. I know that when he was kind of having his journey with communism, he reached conservative ends. And so he kind of changed his tune. And he, I think famously, he had a resignation from the Workers' Party, which was the anti-Stalin Communist Party. And so I don't know exactly when that was, but it's very interesting because some argue that even though Burnham became conservative, his critique of culture seems very leftist, the way that we conventionally think about the superstructure is attributed to Marxism. So when Burnham continues to talk like that when he's a conservative, maybe Paul Godfrey talks about this in his book about fascism, the fact that fascism is almost exclusively looked at through the lens of the left, and that goes for even the smartest people on the right. So, but I mean, it also does make sense. I mean, you can't really make a lot of the economic concerns and the social concerns can often overlap in left and right circles. Hans Hermann Hoppe talks about that and says that he considers that socialism when he calls it social nationalism, and also another way of saying it. But I don't really think that's like a big deal. I think the fact that Burnham came to conservative ends is somewhat genuine, but I don't know at what point that process happened. But it is interesting. It is interesting that you can only see certain things from the loudest voice in the room, so to speak. So, but yes.
On one of the slides, talk about how the United States would be considered an anarcho-tyranny.
Yes.
Do you think that there are other countries like in Europe or Latin America or any other like Western democracy that might be considered an anarcho-tyranny that might be falling into the same thing that the United States is?
As far as I know, some people in the audience might be able to help me out because I usually stick to American discourse, but I do think when Academic Agent, a YouTuber, talks about this, he's a scholar. He focuses on how, what's that guy, the Tory? Tony Blair. Tony Blair is often a Machiavellian because the way that he seemingly seems to put ideology aside and just enforce the thing that gives him the most power. That could, I think, arguably be described as anarcho-tyranny because he also seems to, I don't know about him specifically because I don't really know British politics, but people in the Tory party also gatekeep people that are a little too far to the right or have this identity that is pre-modern. People like Francis and populist types seem to have a harder time. A good example is looking into the arc of like Jeremy Corbyn, somebody who was outspoken, but then eventually towed the line, kind of got welcomed through the gate. So that might not be specifically anarcho-tyranny, but the fact that politics in general just seems to be managerial and some of the riots that happened throughout the 70s and 80s, I don't know to what degree the police were demonized. I sort of have an American crutch. I don't know if they had the same outlook because their 1960s counterculture seems to rhyme with ours. But I think if you were to look into some of those riots and what the responses were at the time, maybe some of the critics that are in Britain at that time, I think the closest example to the American model would probably be the UK, if I had to guess. Well, all right.
This is a mandatory
for Francis. So technically Beautiful Losers is a collection of essays as far as I know. Oh, thank you for reminding me. Zoomer, thank you for reminding me. That is free, available online, thanks to the YouTube account, Skeptical Waves. So that is available. Beautiful Losers is. There's also Counter Rev, which has some audiobooks. They have Leviathan and Its Enemies, which gets into some of the Italian elite theory. Some of the managerialism might make a little more sense. There's also a YouTuber, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. I think it's Gabriel Spock, if I had to guess. He talks about Burnham's managerial revolution book, along with Italian elite theory. He sums things up pretty well. I think he's also a younger guy too. So I think that this can give people some optimism that younger people are checking out some of these older books. Also, many people may not know this. As far as I know, Death of the West was ghostwritten by Sam Francis. I was under the impression that it was Buchanan's writing. But for those that don't know, Buchanan and Francis were contacts. And so when people try to say that Buchanan is too mainstream, he's towing the line too much. And if you look at some of his blog posts recently, it may be possible that he's given the rights over to somebody else because there might be some difference in the takes. But Buchanan's platform was very much in sync with the values of Sam Francis. So for anybody who is skeptical and say that he may have caved after media pressure, I think there's also a very interesting review of Pat Buchanan's Death of the West, and really Buchanan's legacy overall. It's on YouTube. It's I think if you Google search Sam Francis's name, you'll be able to find it pretty well. But a lot of his speeches are still available on YouTube, so that's cool for us. What if that's? I'll check the chat here. We have. All right. Well, thank you one last time, everybody. Appreciate it. Zoomers, man. Zoomers are going to understand the Francis lore. Thank you.